Hello and welcome to another episode of Curious Collections from the Benson Memorial Library. Occasionally while driving through Titusville, you may hear the sound of a train whistle coming from the OC&T railroad tracks. Trains that were an important form of transportation in the early days of town, for people as well as cargo, and train depots with all that ticket money would have been a tempting target for thieves. Late in the 19th century, a gang of safecrackers found themselves up against the law in town when they decided to try their luck robbing the local rail office. So in today's episode, we're going to take a look at the train depot robbery of 1899. Titusville was a bustling place in the latter part of the 1800s. The population of town was nearly double what it is today, and the promise of riches from the oil fields and all the related businesses necessary to support them drew people from all over to the valley that changed the world. The city directory in 1899 listed 8 boarding houses and 16 hotels to hold the swelling population, including places like the Mansion House, which later became the Colonel Drake Hotel, and the United States Hotel, no longer standing, which was located at the corner of Spring and Martin Streets, roughly where the PNC Bank is in the Drake Mall today. In November of that year, 3 newcomers checked into the U.S. Hotel and signed their names in the register as Daniel Kelly, M.F. Maloney, and William F. Snyder, all of Brooklyn, New York. The men spent a few days visiting various businesses in town and said that they worked for a firm that produced safes. 2 different rail lines operated in Titusville at the time, the Western New York and PA Railway and the Dunkirk, Allegheny Valley, and Pittsburgh. The DAV&P, as it was known, was located on South Martin Street, less than a 3-minute walk from the United States Hotel. At around 3 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, November 11th, the DAV&P night engineer, Ed Derby, was sitting in the cab of a steam engine outside the passenger depot when he found himself looking down the barrel of a revolver held by a man with a blue handkerchief hiding his face. The masked man told Derby, "Don't move, stay right where you are." While he kept the night engineer at gunpoint, 2 other men, also masked, smashed their way into the ticket office of the depot and attempted to blow open the safe holding the ticket money. They were using nitroglycerin and dynamite caps that they had purchased at Bryan's hardware store in town the day before. The first charge didn't work, but the second worked a little too well. Instead of cracking just the safe, it took out a large portion of the office. It dropped the plaster ceiling down on their heads, blew out the windows, and alerted police patrolman Michael Moran, who had been standing at the corner of Spring and Franklin Streets. The men scrambled to grab as much money as they could before fleeing the scene, but as much of it was buried under rubble, they ended up with only about $33, which translates to just over $1,054 today. In their hurry, they had missed bags totaling nearly 3 times that amount. They also failed to tie up Ed Derby, the night engineer, who witnessed their escape. The bungling burglars then headed straight to a spot they'd visited earlier in the week, the Slate Roof, a house of ill repute on East Spring Street, roughly across the street from the current middle school parking lot. The Slate Roof was a well-established hotspot in 1899 and did a brisk business, and the ladies of the house had money and expensive jewelry, making them another target for the thieving gang, who were likely disappointed in their small haul from the train station. In fact, the 3 men had attempted to rob the bawdy house the Thursday evening before they hit the train depot, but they were frightened off by customers coming in and escaped out a side door. Tonight, however, they weren't to be deterred. They broke in and caused havoc, capturing the madam of the house, Bertha Bloom, and threatened to torture her by burning the bottoms of her feet until she handed over money and pricey items. In short order, the thieves had collected roughly $800 worth of goods, equivalent to $25,000 today, including cash, diamonds, and jewelry. Back at the train depot, Officer Moran had arrived on the scene to find the office blown apart and the perpetrators already gone, so he called for backup. Officer William Sheehy, who had been patrolling a few blocks over, received the call from Moran and went and fetched Police Chief Daniel McGraw from his house on South Franklin Street. The newspapers at the time painted Police Chief McGraw as the quintessential lawman. He first came to Titusville from New York around 1877 and joined the police force in 1883. By the time of the robbery, he had been chief of police for more than a decade. He was tall, over 6 feet in his stocking feet, prodigiously strong, tough on crime, and a devoted family man with 2 teenage sons. In his obituary, the Herald stated that his name was a terror to all evildoers everywhere, and during his administration of the police department, the city was remarkably free from molestation by tough characters of all kinds. McGraw and Sheehy quickly made their way to the depot, where Ed Derby, the night engineer, informed them of what he'd seen. The two then followed the safecrackers trail up the railroad tracks and onto the Slate Roof, a spot with which the officers were familiar since they'd conducted a raid there some time prior. The details of what happened at the brothel are not exactly clear, but statements from Officer Sheehy and the women of the establishment said something along these lines. The officers heard noises inside the premises and entered. Almost immediately, Chief McGraw grabbed one of the 3 thieves who had been acting as a lookout and grappled with him. The other 2, including the man in the blue handkerchief who had held Ed Derby at gunpoint, opened fire on the lawmen. Officer Sheehy was moving to assist the chief and was hit first, taking a bullet to the mouth that knocked out some of his teeth and lodged in the back of his skull under his left ear. Dazed, he left the building, was found outside, and taken to the No. 1 hose house next door to City Hall to be treated. Chief McGraw was hit twice, once in the arm, which he appeared to shrug off, but the second bullet tore through his abdomen. He let go of the man he'd been grappling with and managed to get off a shot of his own, possibly with a gun he'd wrested from the lookout, and hit the man in the blue handkerchief squarely in the chest. Incapacitated and on his own, the chief wasn't able to prevent the thieves from escaping. The 2 uninjured men made off in one direction, one leaving his hat behind, while the one who'd been shot headed in the opposite direction. The wounded police chief staggered his way several blocks west and ironically ended up at the United States Hotel where the thieves had been staying. He was quickly put in a room and 5 different doctors were called in to assist. The newspaper reported that during all this the chief was cheerful, conscious, and rational, and it was thought that he would recover. However, within a few days infections set in, and Chief McGraw died the morning of Wednesday, November 15th of septic peritonitis. A full-on manhunt commenced to run down the perpetrators of the crime. Late Saturday evening, the same day as the robbery, the first man was discovered, the one in the blue handkerchief who'd been shot by Chief McGraw and had signed himself as M.F. Maloney at the U.S. Hotel. A night watchman at the American Oil Works discovered his body some distance east of the Slate Roof. The body was taken to McNett's Undertaking on West Central Avenue, and after an autopsy where it was determined that Chief McGraw's bullet had torn through his pulmonary arteries, the body was put on display to see if an identification could be made. Hundreds of people came to view the deceased, but after some time and considerable delays to McNett's other work, the body was eventually removed from the undertakers and locked up at City Hall. Finally, after no one came forward with a positive ID, the body was donated to a dental school in Philadelphia. The man's real name was never discovered. The thief who had signed himself as Daniel Kelly at the hotel was quickly apprehended near Grand Valley and brought back to town, where he narrowly avoided being lynched by the townspeople. It was determined that he was the one whose hat had been left behind at the Slate Roof, and he had been one of the 2 shooters. His case eventually went to trial in Meadville, where it came to light that his real name was Daniel Kehoe of Brooklyn, New York, and that he'd already spent time in Western Penitentiary in Allegheny County for post office theft prior to the robbery at the train depot. He was eventually convicted of first-degree murder and was one of the last people to be hanged in Crawford County in April of 1901. The final man, who had gone by the name William Snyder, was thought to have been seen outside town at a few distant farms, but managed to avoid capture for nearly 2 years before an anonymous tip led to West Virginia, where the man was identified and then returned to Crawford County for trial. His real name was Frank Woodard, and he, like Daniel Kehoe, was no stranger to jail. He had spent a term in prison in Little Valley, New York, for the murder of a Native American woman. He was taken to court in February of 1902 and was found guilty of burglary and murder in the 2nd degree. He was sent to prison and eventually released in 1913. Town slowly recovered from the shock of the robbery and the death of their police chief. Officer Michael Moran was appointed chief of police to replace Chief McGraw, but died of kidney disease in July of 1901, a few short months after the execution of Daniel Kehoe. William Sheehy, who survived his brush with the burglars and eventually coughed up the bullet that hit him, was back on the beat within a month after being shot and was one of the star witnesses in the trial against Kehoe. Bertha Bloom, the other major witness at the Kehoe trial, continued to operate the slate roof until 1916, when between public pressure from the Reverend J.J. Bullen that led to her arrest for running a house of ill repute, and a bad case of rheumatism, she decided to retire. The DAV&P depot was patched up and passenger trains continued to run on the route until 1937. The depot building was later sold and used as a feed mill before it was finally demolished in 1966. Resolutions commending Chief McGraw for his actions were made by the town council immediately after his death, and in 1991 the chief's name was added to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington's Judicial Square. That trying time in 1899 was hard on town, but it was also a reminder to bad actors that while Titusville may have been a young, booming city, little would get past the law. If you're interested in learning more about the depot robbery and the lawmen of Titusville's past, be sure to check out the newspaper archives available online through the Benson Library website, or go to the catalog and browse the local history titles that can be checked out from the collection. Until next time, we'll see you in the stacks. Bye now.